Les tengo el dato de la Juanfe. En 20 años ha impactado directamente a 245.564 personas. Más importante, a madres adolescentes en condiciones de vulnerabilidad y exclusión en las ciudades de Cartagena y Medellín.
Continuamos con nuestro siguiente conversatorio, Oportunidades para las mujeres, una lucha que no distingue edad, género ni fronteras. Tenemos dos grandes invitadas, Jacqueline Novogratz, ella es fundadora y directora ejecutiva de Acumen, autora del bestseller The Blue Sweater, y nuestra querida Pat Mitchell. Estas dos mujeres nos contarán sobre sus historias personales y experiencias creando cambios en el mundo, sus más recientes libros, Manifiesto para una revolución moral convirtiendo sueños en acción y Tiempos peligrosos exigen mujeres peligrosas, respectivamente. Moni, cuéntanos más sobre nuestras siguientes invitadas.
Jacqueline Novogratz es la fundadora y directora ejecutiva de Acumen, un fondo de capital de riesgo sin fines de lucro que utiliza un enfoque empresarial para abordar la pobreza mundial. Pat Mitchell, reconocida ejecutiva de medios de los Estados Unidos, es la directora editorial de TEDWomen. A lo largo de su carrera como periodista, productora, ganadora de un Emmy y ejecutiva, se ha centrado en compartir historias de mujeres.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pat Mitchell. It's always a privilege to be involved in any way with women working for the world and to support Catalina and the Wanfei Foundation. And today is a very special privilege. I get to introduce you to a woman that I had hoped to bring in person to the women working for the world, and we'll still look forward to that day too. Jacqueline Novogratz is known all over the world as a globally respected entrepreneur leader, someone who has quite literally transformed the social impact investing space with a nonprofit organization called Acumen. Acumen, and I was proud to serve on that board for many years, has transformed the work of delivering services to the poor in the world as by standing, as they say, with the poor. And in doing so, has raised more than $135 million to fund social entrepreneurs who are actually doing the work on the ground, and recently has reached 330 million people with these services. Until recently, Acumen worked in India, Pakistan, East and West Africa, but not long ago expanded to an Acumen presence in Latin America based in Colombia. So it is with great privilege that I welcome you to Colombia, Jacqueline, at least virtually.
Thank you so much, Pat and Catalina and everyone. This is such a pleasure for me. Colombia as a country, as Pat knows, that I absolutely adore. And I'm looking forward to being there in person, Pat, with you next year.
There's no question that must be a priority for us. But for today, I'd love for this community of activists and investors and entrepreneurs, people who care deeply about their country and its future. What led you and Acumen to decide to focus your work in Colombia and Latin America?
So, Pat, thanks for that question. I started Acumen now 20 years ago to change the way the world tackles poverty by, as you say, raising philanthropy and investing long-term in entrepreneurs that were focused on solving some of our biggest problems like healthcare and education and water and energy and agriculture. And for the first 10, 12 years, we did just that in the regions that you spoke about, mostly South Asia and East and West Africa. And then it seemed time to expand our operations geographically. And an easy expand would have been right in the regions in which we were operating. And yet it struck me one night that about 10 years ago, the world's inequality was just pulling us apart. And yet we rarely talked about the poverty of inequality in ways that were truly understandable, articulate, and had solutions addressed to them. And so we looked around the world and looked at Latin America. And at that time, particularly, Colombia was one of the most unequal economies on the planet. And yet it also had within it one of the most incredible talent pools, individuals of privilege who were seeing their country at that point coming out of 50 years of civil war and wanting to use their skills to do something about it. And so we began to work in Colombia and Peru about 8 years ago, and have an amazing team now based in Bogota that runs the patient capital work that we do, as well as a for-profit fund called Alive. And then we have a fellows program with individuals from across this incredible nation. What struck me, Pat, as surprising when we first started doing the work is in part because of the nature of geography that has kept people in post-conflict areas so isolated, without trust, without income, limited skills, competing often with illegal industries, foreign aid, that what we found not just relative poverty, we actually found areas of absolute poverty, and began to try then to understand, how do you not only use business as a tool for peace, but how do you do so in ways that are based in community, that transfer ownership, that enable participation of men and women so that people can solve their own problems. And in ways I never would have been able to predict, Colombia has been a laboratory for us of some of the most innovative, I believe, blueprints for not only how we solve poverty, but how we start to change capitalism.
Your principles and the values behind Acumen, Jacqueline, sound so much like the values and align so closely with the purpose of the One Fe Foundation, which Catalina looked around her country, as you say, coming out of a long-term conflict, and realized that something still must be done to disrupt that cycle of family violence, the cycle of poverty that was leading so many of Colombia's young women in particular to get caught up and unable to free themselves of that cycle. I'd love to know more about how you're observing Acumen's work in doing that through the new for-profit fund, Alive. How are these things coming together so that they are all leading toward the same end, right? Which is alleviating the inequality that's leading to the absolute poverty.
Thanks, Pat. In some ways, it starts with Acumen Academy, our fellows program that draws from people across the nation. We are very deliberate in identifying people across race and class and ethnicity and religion. I believe well over 50% of our applicants come from post-conflict areas. We're very focused on gender in that selection. And this group is extraordinary. Some are working with ex-combatants, bringing them into the economy, trying to build real opportunity for them. I would say the fellows have not only helped us understand at a deeper level the different parts of Colombia, but are giving us a direct sight line into some of that really early stage work at community level. And for me personally, they are teaching me this new generation's focus on collective action as opposed to individual action. And I think that that's a space we should really be paying attention to. Then there's Acumen's Pioneer Capital. And that would be where we would not just make investments in companies like Cacao de Colombia, which is a chocolate company working with different communities in post-conflict areas from Tumaco to the Sierra Nevada with the Arhuacos, whereby Cacao de Colombia accompanies the communities, provides them with skills and training, great transparency, participation so that they're earning living wages, not just earning what traditional farmers make. And in building a company that actually not only is on its way to profitability, but is so focused on quality and so focused on all of the stakeholders, then Acumen can use its its own platform of privilege, Pat. And Cacao Colombia then will partner with a Crepes and Waffles, which is an amazing corporation with a social purpose across Colombia, and with another one of our investments, Selva Nevada, which makes a beautiful ice cream, also using the chocolate. And so what we're seeing is this ecosystem that has to include the private sector, has to include civil society, has to include corporations, and has to include the government, can start to solve these problems. But it starts with immersion, getting close to the people, solidarity, not just offering them capital, but accompanying them so that they can build their muscles and understand what they're doing and building as well. And then, as I said, using our social capital, our platform of privilege to connect companies inside Colombia and across the world.
Acumen has always looked at the intersectionality of poverty as well as many of the other global challenges that are outcomes, are at least factors in the continuation of extreme poverty in the world. But you've also looked at the solving, finding the just and sustainable solutions also involve that kind of intersectionality. Talk a little bit more about that, because in Colombia, through the work I've observed of the One Faith Foundation and the work I know that you've just referenced in part that Acumen does there, it begins with community. It recognizes there is a strong, vibrant community. It begins with being proximate to the problem. What are the other lessons that have come out of Acumen's work that might inform the work of those who are with us today?
Thanks. But in my book, Manifesto for Moral Revolution, I talk about 13 practices, not just principles, because it takes a lot of practice to make these work. And the first is what we would call the moral imagination, the humility to see the world as it is, and the audacity to imagine what it could be. And so you take a company like Gigante, which is a coffee company in Huila, another post-conflict area. The humility to see the world as it is, recognize that there wasn't trust, that the farmers were growing coffee, but still earning not enough to make a living, and in fact, many times not enough to cover their costs. That these were families, not just individual farmers. And so we had to understand all of the different roles of the family as they pertain to the association. It took about 3 years, not only with Acumen, but with a nonprofit called TechnoServe and with Nespresso, the corporation providing technical assistance, to get to the point where we could then not just immerse, but partner. Not always a comfortable partnership with the Association of Farmers and with these other entities. And that takes a level of vulnerability as well as honesty. And then structure, using investment as a means, not as an end. Structure the investment so that as the Farmers Association pay back Acumen, they will own their company. So that long-term, this community association of farmers will not have only gained business school skills, but a higher level of quality of coffee. But they will also have an ownership model, because one thing that you and I know, and I have learned over and over, is that income does not create wealth. Assets create wealth. And wealth is what moves us out of poverty, because it allows us to have more choice and more understanding and opportunity, and that is dignity. And I say it all the time, but 20 years ago, maybe I would have thought the opposite of poverty is income. The opposite of poverty is dignity.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm so glad you referenced the book, because I want to show it for everyone. It is available on Amazon and bookstores all over the world, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. And in it, Jacqueline does outline very clear practices that businesses, nonprofits, individuals actually, all of us can contribute to a world built on on more moral principles and values that can be underneath and actually animating all of our actions. When I hear you speak about it, and when I read the book and I see example after example, many of which you have named today, of how it works when you put these principles and these practices into place, they work. So why are there still so many challenges and problems we haven't solved yet?
Oh, Pat, because it is so hard. When we're little and we hear about the status quo, at least in my case, I thought the status quo was like the big bad guys that didn't want you to create change. The status quo was us. Human beings don't like change. And I've worked longest in India and Pakistan with Acumen. And the example there was really where I learned it, that when you were working in low-income communities, and it's the same in Colombia, you're not looking at a market economy, you're looking at a political economy. Everybody has their hands in the lives of low-income people. The government, the charities, I would call them the cheats, or like the mafias that will extort, provide services at extortionary rates. The slumlords, sometimes the religious leaders, sometimes the family, and particularly when it comes to women. Family that will hold the women back. And over time, we who have felt marginal or vulnerable begin to hold ourselves back because we've internalized all of that. And so change, particularly when you're using a market mechanism, which is uncomfortable anyway, is hard. And it is not for the faint of heart. And that's why we have to find those entrepreneurs, like so many that are operating across Colombia and Peru and across the world, that what separates them is not only a moral compass, an ability to stand with the poor and understand who they are from their perspective and build, but they've got to have words that we don't associate with moral leadership enough, and that is a toughness, a grittiness, and a determination. And Pat, it's what you embody, that there's a soft, there's a heart, and man, is there a toughness to get the work done. And we've got to inculcate that in all of us.
I consider that a great compliment, by the way.
It's a great compliment.
But you describe it in a way that I really think says everything. You describe it as having a hard-edged optimism, right?
Hard-edged hope.
Hard-edged hope. I knew it wasn't optimism, but I couldn't be.
That's my husband.
So how do you keep a hard-edged hope when you are facing the problems that you and others in this community face every day?
Pat, you wrote a book, Becoming a Dangerous Woman, and I'm starting to really understand what that is about, because I think one of the benefits of getting older is not only do you know how hard things are, but you know that change is possible. And I can look back now at a world that is very different from the world I grew up in a lot of ways that are better. And so that's number one. And number two is, as you know, I have not only had to hit my head against many, many walls, but I've seen extraordinary suffering and loss going through the Rwandan genocide and watching many friends, or not personally watching, but experiencing many friends being murdered or being bystanders, or worse, being perpetrators. What that means to the psyche, that you have to take 2 steps back and keep going forward. I would say that doing this work is a privilege. And in a way, those people who've given their lives and stood before us have made it easier for us. And we therefore have a responsibility to carry that work forward. One of a good friend of mine who was a fellow back in 1998 at Rockefeller Foundation, named Ingrid Washinawata, the leader of the Menominee tribe in the United States, and a real voice for indigenous people. And she worked in Colombia. She came down to work with the Ua indigenous tribe. And she was captured and tortured by the FARC and ultimately killed. And that was another devastating blow in my life. But the idea that there is a team of extraordinary people connected to a community that supports them, building with community, in community, where Ingrid had such high aspirations, to me is so hopeful. And so if I were talking to a young change maker today, and Catalina understands this too, it is to recognize that this work is long, it is hard. It can not only be decades long, it can be lifetime long. It's worth it. And the piece that we don't talk about enough is that at every step along the way, there's beauty to be found. There's beauty in the circularity of Ingrid Washanawatok's story and her spirit flowing through. There's beauty in connecting with the people who you are there not only to serve, but to be with in solidarity. There's beauty just in the physicality of the places that we get to work, and it's often in the meanest, toughest places where people manifest that beauty through song and art, celebration. And again, Colombia stands apart as a country that just does that in technicolor. And I think beauty is the urge to life. And doing this work allows you to work with people who are fully alive and to be used in ways that ultimately help heal us as we do our best to heal the broken heart of this weary world of ours.
So beautifully said, Jacqueline. What a privilege it is to know you as a friend, to have worked with you over the years, and to now have shared you with another sisterhood that I care deeply about, the sisterhood that Catalina and her fabulous team have built in Colombia and throughout Latin America as they improve the lives of women and girls on that continent. And I want to express profound gratitude, Jacqueline, for all the lives that you and the work of Acumen have transformed, and for that hard-edged hope that reminds us that being alive is looking for the beauty. So here's a promise. We're going to dance together in Colombia.
We are going to dance in Colombia with all the other extraordinary women change makers that are the hope of the future.
You have given us that hope today, so I hope that everyone gathering with us today feels it, and we know that very soon, hopefully, in good health and safety, we will all be alive, doing this work, and alive together. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Pat.